So today we're going to be covering a crash course on Camille support. So for those that don't know, Camille support's been pretty much dominating the meta right now in terms of win rate. She's kind of up there for some reason, and I'm sure there's more of you that are pretty curious as to why it works and why it works the way it does. So I want to give an explanation as to how to pilot the champ and everything surrounding the playstyle of it, because it's actually super fun. And there's a lot that goes into playing Camille support that's a little bit unorthodox compared to, I would say, any other support in the roster. And it's in a good way, but in a way that would take a lot of reps. And it does help a lot if you have a little bit of a background playing Camille in the top lane. But I think right now, due to the map changes and the walls that were affected, her ability to play in top lane was stunted significantly, at least in my opinion, and when I talked to a couple Camille players. So the fix was just throwing her into the support, giving her a lot of damage, and then pretty much just taking it from there. So I want to cover a bunch of the different components of this sort of build and this sort of playstyle, like the usual like rune setups and playstyle and what you're going for, and I think it's really cool. So overall, the overarching sort of champion identity with Camille support is that it is an engage support. It's very high engage. All the great things about Camille with your engage range and the ganks. Imagine that, but you're ganking all the time, and that's pretty much how it works. And this is supplemented by some incredible level 1 potential, probably some of the highest in the game, because of her all-in-one ability in her hookshot that she can take at level 1. And then her whole rune setup and all of her itemization and strategy is surrounded around that. So she has a really, really high engage range and a lot of lockdown potential, or rather, because of the high engage range, she has less lockdown potential than other champions in the class, let's say Pyke or Leona Nautilus, right? She's not the same as those. She would probably be closer to Pyke, but stylistically in terms of high damage output, or maybe someone like Pantheon, where she doesn't really have that much lockdown until maybe with Hextech Ultimatum at 6, but that's the overall style. Your laning phase is excellent as long as your matchup is good, and we'll touch on the matchups because there's a lot of volatility in them. And then there's awesome roam potential, like excellent roam potential. You have a lot of agency to carry the game. A lot of the times, you're going to be so strong that you're like solo killing people, or you're like pushing side lane by yourself, or you can just go invade the enemy jungler by yourself because you're that strong. That's how strong you are in the early game. Of course, the downside of this is that if you don't do well in the early game, this build tends to run it down really easily. So if you're not 10-0, it's very often you're 0-10, because you need resources and you need high damage output for the build to make sense, because you're just a shittier version of these other engaged champions if you don't have damage, because your lockdown is relatively limited, all things considered. So I want to cover some other aspects like your drafting, ability combos that maybe if you're not familiar, a quick touch up on that, and then the rune setups required, as well as itemization and just overall style. So let's start with draft. The idea behind it is that although she has sort of like a generalist kit, she's not actually that blindable in terms of where you can slot Camille in draft. So if I go, it's because there's a lot of really good matchups and bad matchups. And let's say just for as a blanket statement, you're B1ing Camille, right? And it's still Camille, and there's a lot of matchups where she can exceed very well, but in other matchups she doesn't do very well at all. So let's talk about some good matchups, right? So anybody that thrives on having really long range, so let's say Senna lanes, it's going to be excellent. So, but it depends on who the Senna is paired with. So it could be a bad example. So let's say it's something like Lux and then any random AD carry, Azrael, right? This is probably your prime Camille matchup, right? Lux, Ezreal, they both want to be as far as possible. They want to play within their space, their 1,000, 1,200 unit space with their abilities. Camille just threatens that with her single ability at all phases of the lane, and you can blow flashes at any point in the lane It's very, very hard for these two champions to really harass you because you're going to have so much threat and so much kill threat. And that's what's make it really easy for you to play. However, what's a harder version of this is like enemy picks Renata or something. Very, very difficult because your whole identity is surrounded by the fact that you are a engaged champion. So you have a lot of the same downfalls as engaged champions. This doesn't mean that your matchup is not playable because I've played the Renata matchup. It is playable. It's just that there's a lot of different matchups that might feel a little bit worse. Like Braum is similar. There are some enchanters that are defensive that you can get away with. So I think you're playing into Lulu is fine or playing into Janna is fine. But it's really contingent on your ability to really how the enemy can address your all-in. The other version is if the enemy also can just stat check you. So it's actually bad into Leona, ironically. Like kind of ironically, but not really, because it kind of makes sense, right? Leona is just pretty much the premier sort of lockdown stat check sort of champion in the early phases, and Camille is not going to really have any exception to that. So that's why Camille support is generally regarded as a better pick the later you can go, because then you can tailor and evaluate whether it's good or not and see the matchup, right? What a common thing that people could be thinking is that what if we pick Camille early and then reflex it? Now, it depends on the meta, but and while this is not a bad idea on paper, and I commend you for thinking about it, there is the potential threat for what I call a fake flex. So while some champions can be flexed, it's not a real flex in a meaningful sense, because let's say Camille is one of those champions that could probably be countered in both lanes, because presumably the flex we're talking about, at least in this current day and age, is between top and support. So let's say Camille is in her current state. She's pretty good, but not like incredible. Let's say they go like Jack's top and let's ignore the slots, and then they go Leona bot, or they even go like Renekton. That's a pretty typical comp in some metas. Where is Renekton, right? Let's say they go Renekton Leona. You're actually sad no matter where you go because you got countered in both. Now, the second layer of this could be that, hey, I want to bait you into playing Renekton Leona and have you think about that matchup, or have you play those champs so that subsequently I can pick champs and pick where my Camille goes to lose, and then potentially get a winning matchup there. In the case of Renekton Leona, that's probably not going to happen most of the time. It's a little bit hard. You could go like Gnar and deal with the Leona or something, or like if you're trying to go forward and stat check, like it's a little bit of a weird one, right? But you can kind of see the idea, because then you force them to reveal their hand a little bit. Then in some metas, let's say it's Galen Morgana is viable or something insane like that. You know, it's just. It's not good. Let me make that clear. But I'm trying to give you options in terms of what potentially could work. But let's give another example. Another really common fake flex is Lux, because it's very easy to come up with a lot of compositions that have, or combos that have not really many weaknesses that can counter Lux both in mid and support, which is the two roles that she's going to be played in, right? Because you can just play Nautilus and then you just play Fizz mid or something, right? Or because I'm thinking more of amateur sort of levels. But like if you want another example, you could go like Akali or Ari, or even like, you know, there's a lot of options here that would make Lux not too happy. And you know, that's why typically you don't see her picked, you know, oh, we can flex Lux mid. It's just Caitlyn Lux 1-2. Something like that. So that's the same mindset here. Are there bad matchups for Camille? I'm sure you can kind of feel them out as I pick them out, because they sound very Cancer once you hear it. Poppy is very Cancer. It's not playable. Janna was like okay, but the other one that's a little bit weird, that's actually pretty annoying, that from my experimentation, was actually Shaco. And it is because your hookshot is perma prevented from going in. This is a very niche matchup, and this is something that you probably will never see most of the time, but that's another example. There's a lot of different matchups that will give you a hard time, and like if the kill threat potential isn't there, Camile's pretty much useless. She needs to be able to get kills. So that's pretty much that. In terms of good duos with Camile as well, because that's something important to touch on, I would say she works well with forward champs that don't need as much setup. So let's say like champions that are okay and don't need a Leona or Nautilus to basically set up. So for me, that comes to mind where a lot of generalist champions or utility ADCs work as well. So Varus would be great, I would say. Ashe would be fine. Let's say even Tristana would be pretty okay because it's a very forward lane, or like Lucian is like alright. You know, you can get away with a lot of different combos. I wouldn't recommend it with some champs, but I can see it working to some degree with a lot of ADCs. And I wouldn't like be brain dead picking it like I would be if we were drafting for like a Leona's Nautilus and if you're picking it early or something and they're prominent champions. So that's pretty much the idea in draft. And TLDR, pick it late, and then your matchup, and then you can evaluate your matchup. Now, let's jump into tool, and we can test some tech. And I listed it out here, and we can touch on the other stuff. So for your rune setup, while we're here, this is pretty much the main rune setup you're gonna go. Don't worry about it. We can touch on it in depth later, because the most important part right now is to go over the combos, and the setup will supplement the combos, and I can touch on that in a little bit. But TLDR, the main setup you're going for is going to be with Hail of Blades, because you're going to trade extremely quickly, and I'll show you examples of this. And everything, all the runes basically supplement that. There's nothing special around that. Okay, so we're in, and pretty much let's talk about some of the combos. And some of them you may know if you play a little bit of Camile, and some of them might not be so well known, right? So the first one is with Hookshot. Let's just talk about it in isolation. And the idea here is it's not necessarily a combo. Well, we're talking about useful things that you can do with Camile. So Hookshot, you might be familiar. You go like that, and you just fly in, right? But obviously, when you're facing a player that's conscious of it, it's a little bit harder to kind of execute. So the first one I recommend is actually hugging a wall and going for the fast E. I messed that up, but there, the fast E. So notice how E1 is contingent on you snapping to a wall, right? So when you do it like that, it lets you take advantage of the human mind in the sense of that there's limited reaction speed, and it's a lot faster for you to actually hit it. So, and because of that, there's actually some really good sweet spots that if the enemy doesn't know how to play against Camile, they end up getting punished a lot. So what I find that often that happens is, let's say you're in lane, let's say we're red side, right? And an enemy laner is right here, and I'm chilling here. Usually, laners will naturally position opposite of where you are in the lane. So I like to hug the bottom bush and try to take control. And then they don't realize that it's actually already too late, and they're too close. And because usually once they see you're engaged, they'll start to walk back. But with a champion like Camile, your engage rate is so long, by the time you go for it, they're already in range. So even if he realistically walks this way, then he's probably still boned and going to take a really bad trade. And that's going to equate to a really simple combo for you, because you go here, go in, you auto 3 times, and then you have your passive shield as well. So every time you have your passive, it's pretty much a free trade because it's such a significant shield. And then you're basically trading around your rune windows, and then after that, you're pretty much set. So hopefully that makes sense. So another version of the Camile combo is E1. I messed it up, but into Q2, because you prime your Q1 onto your creep, and then you press it with Q2. It's not actually, it's more of a top lane combo, I would say, because it's meant for short trades. Because in this version of Camile, you're all inning most of the time, so you're not going to be doing that most of the time. But it is useful for when you feel like you can't commit to an all-in in specific situations. Another version of your E is to actually stagger it. This is a very common one. So let's say you're waiting for, it's very good to use it when you're waiting for someone's flash. So let's say you're going for an engage and it could potentially kill this person, right? You press E1 and then you wait for them to potentially flash and you can stagger E2, right? Then there's of course E flash. Make sure that with this one, you have to make sure you're flashing into them, because once you flash, I think your E is done, right? So the way it's coded is that it only will cause it to impact if you flash on top of them on E2. That's the only way it will work. So now once you hit level 2, right, the version of the trade ends up being like you just auto reset everything and you go for like a really big trade like that. And then what happens is your Hail of Blades gets you a lot of free auto resets and gives you a lot of enhanced autos. So it ends up feeling really good. Sometimes it's okay to not even wait for the true damage. Like going for something like that and not even waiting for it is actually okay too, because sometimes you're going to get away by then. So that's another example. I can't give an example in practice tool, but a really good one is to also auto queue keywords. Should be basic enough because it lets you, it's kind of like Leona, except you have 2 Leona queues and it lets you go for that. What else is there? There's more advanced stuff, but I wouldn't really recommend it for most people unless you're really, really confident, because it's a lot of risk for not a lot of reward. So these are like these W combos, which are like really cool and flashy, but like it's not really necessary. Or like these these QE sort of fadeaway combos, that's also not necessary, but I digress. Just more options for you guys if you so want it. The key to the combo as well is that like with the Camille changes, because they nerfed her in top lane, with the fact that there's not nearly as many, like there's too much room for a lot of engages now. Like you can play a lot of matchups weirdly, and they compensated Camille by just giving her a bunch of move speed on her Q. So that's going to be the trick to why your engages work after a bit, because you can actually keep up with the opponent. I guess with an aside, we can kind of quickly touch on your ability points. So notice that I did put 3 points into Q. You definitely do want to be putting your points into Q in most matchups, because that's where you're going to get your most consistent damage output and move speed. And it's more consistent than, let's say, maxing E. Maxing E is actually pretty strong in matchups where you are able to guarantee that you're going to hit the opponent, and you're just so ridiculously ahead that it doesn't really matter. And you can use the reduced cooldown from its levels and then take advantage of that and take over the game. That is the main case that I would justify it. And you also want to take E at level 1 in most matchups, so you can trade around that, and then Q at level 2, unless you feel like you can't all in. And then I would recommend W. But generally speaking, it's E level 1, Q level 2, then max Q. And then you kind of go from there. In terms of your items, so let's pretend we have 500 gold. Actually, let's just nuke the game. So we have 500 gold now, right? So at least from the timing of this recording, World Atlas, if you're new to the champ and you don't really know your windows, I would recommend World Atlas because it's just a support item, right? But let's say you're an experienced Camille player. What people have been going these days is you actually start Doran's item on support. And the reason for this is that this is a broken ass item, level 1. And this is really good for your early trades, as you can tell, because this is 10 AD and 100 health. That's like 600 gold worth of stats or something for 450. So you're just going to be way, way stronger. Also keep in mind that, let's say the opponent goes World Atlas. They basically have no stats because they got regen and a little bit of HP. I got triple the amount of HP and I have a long sword on top of that. So that's why people have been favoring this style so much, and a lot of pro play as well. And it's specifically because your first 3 waves are so important in a lot of these matchups, and that's why there's been quad Doran's items in the bottom lane. This is also supplemented by the fact, at least right now, that World Atlas the stacks don't actually start at the beginning of the game compared to, if you recall, with things like Spell Thieves. With Spell Thieves Edge, you had your stacks kind of ticking from the get-go, if I recall. But with World Atlas, your stacks start only at a minute 50. So actually, there is no gold loss on World Atlas until around wave 2, which is fine, because then you're like, all right, I'm going to just blast this kid in lane, and then by the time I get my first back, play first 3 waves, play for 4 or 5 waves, then you go home, or you've killed them by then because you have Doran's Blade, and then you get the gold and you buy World Atlas, and that's pretty much how it works. So that's kind of the setup, right? You always want to be looking for these sort of aggressive engages whenever possible, even on wave 1, because on wave 1 it's still pretty good. So let's say wave 1's here, right? You're chilling, you can go for it. You can just go for it because you have Hail of Blades and you have so much damage. Like you get so much stats from going in. Like, trust me, you are so strong in the matchups that you are like playing well in. Even in your bad matchups, level 1 you probably still win. So I wouldn't really worry about it. You can kind of play like a psychopath, and that's kind of the idea with this build. And that's what makes it fun. So after that, this is pretty much what your build's gonna look like. I go for a bit of a funny version of the build. I actually skip boots some games because, hear me out. The logic behind it is that you really need damage, as I mentioned, right? You have to build damage as much as possible. And Camille is unique in that her mobility with hookshot is not tied to boots. So I just rely on hookshot a lot of the time, and then I itemize as much damage as humanly possible so that I don't have any issues. However, people do build boots, so I will recommend boots. So you can go that. And best item for the most part is Sundered Sky as your core, because it lets you just trade like a psychopath and you're just autoing everybody. This is what I've been seeing the most of, although there have been other combos that are good. And then the typical second item is going to be Sterix Gauge, because these are 2 really good bruiser items that give you a lot of survivability and it just lets you do a lot of stuff. And I think there's probably extra options that like are surely viable, and I don't really doubt that, and I don't really think that's an issue. So for your support item, it's going to be Bloodsong every time, because it's literally Sheen, and it's Sheen with PTA built into the Sheen proc. And this is unbelievably broken for Camille because she loves Sheen so much, right? And this is what makes her able to 1v1 champions sometimes, even as a support. She still does 1,000 true damage sometimes with Bloodsong and her items. So pretty much almost guaranteed you should be getting this item every time. Unless there is some reason that you really, really need like Celestial opposition or something, and then you go Sheen yourself. But I really don't see that being a viable option. Other good items, I could say Eclipse is pretty solid. I think it does the job really well because it has a lot of damage output, and the Eclipse Shield lets you snowball really well. But if you need defensive stats or you're not insanely ahead, I would recommend the above 2 items. Even other items, like, I haven't experimented insanely with some of these, but I'm sure like things like Stridebreaker are good, or even Titanic Hydra is not bad. But in terms of what you're looking for from some items, you generally just want bruiser items that supplement this style. I've seen some builds with, and I've tried it with lethality actually, and it's really funny because of the amount of damage you do. And you're basically, it's fine. You would think that, oh, Camille does true damage, so why are you building it? But it's fine because you have so much lethality that you're just absolutely one-tapping them. I would say this is a sort of do not try this at home type of build, because I think Camille needs the sort of stats that come along, the defensive stats that come along with her core items, and she benefits a lot more from these items in general. But if you're really obnoxiously ahead, you could go for builds like this and just absolutely murder people, because you're not even going to use your true damage Q2. You're just going to kill them, like, straight up. Like, it's not going to matter, right? That's the idea behind it. So yeah, that's pretty much touching on your builds. And from that point, you've usually won the game. So I would use your best judgment based on what's been good. So now before we jump back into the practice tool, I kind of want to touch on some runes. And I did mention, spoiler before, that hey, you're gonna run Hail on Camille, and this is going to be your setup for the most part, and everything's supposed to supplement that. So, of course, you run Hail. Sudden Impact is probably just best in slot for the most part. I think Cheap Shot's fine as well, but I think Sudden Impact's going to get you more damage overall, and it's more consistent because Cheap Shot is contingent on you hitting your E, and you're not always going to hit your E. So Sudden Impact gives you consistent damage because you just have to dash, and Hook Shot is your dash. People go Eyeball Collection all the time because they just want to kill people, and that's usually the fastest way to get the stacks if that's what you're going for. However, I do think the other two options are fine. And for the last slot, Treasure Hunter is probably best in slot because you want the itemization and you want extra gold wherever possible. Now, for your secondary tree, pretty much all the time I've seen people go with this setup. And the only variation I would really go for is changing your second row. So what I mean by this is that Shield Bash is really good with your passive and lets you trade incredibly well and increases your damage output. And then Bone Plating also does this sort of same thing, right? Every now and then when your cooldowns are up, all right, guys, we're going to send it. And we're just going to go in. They're going to absorb Bone Plating. They're going to absorb Shield Bash. I'm going to have Hail of Blades up. It's going to be a fat trade. It doesn't matter what you have. So with that, you take double adaptive and flat health because you want to curb stomp them in the early game. That's basically what you want to do. I can't really think of other setups that would be better than this. I'm going to be honest with you. You could... I'm just coping. I don't even think there is one. I think that's probably as ideal as you'd want to get in terms of the champion identity with this build. So, there's that. What are we missing? I think it's kind of just like I've talked about everything in terms of the overall style. Now it's just kind of like team fighting and stuff, in which case you're basically still Camille. Like just do Camille things, just take the nearest AD carry, wipe them out, make sure they want to end it all. And yeah, when you're playing for objectives and you're playing for vision control, you really want to be using that roaming potential you have and that kill potential you have to just put out as much pressure as possible. Because if you're not ahead and you're not blowing the game open, the game will very quickly kind of collapse on you, and you're gonna realize there's gonna be a lot of games where you're like not 5-0, and then you're like, damn, I'm actually kind of useless here. And that's kind of the play style you want to be. You want to play so to your limits that you get rewarded for it. And there's a lot of stuff that you get rewarded for on a champion like Camille that there's really no other support in the game that can do right now. So because of that, I think she's really fun. Really recommend you try it. And if you have any questions, let me know down below. See you guys.